Right. Okay. So moving on to um, some of the elements of the swing and
Sure.
asking those type of questions that can further help that student and help you with your lesson planning. What lesson number do you usually ask types of questions like, hey, pitch selection, timing? Let's talk about hitting now. Let's not just go into mechanics. Let's not just actually do the physical movement, but let's talk about this and see if we can progress that way as well.
Sure. It honestly depends on where the hitter is at. So I might get an 18-year-old who has gone to plenty of hitting lessons and
Hmm.
is really well versed in their swing, and I can have that conversation with them almost immediately. I'll have other hitters that I'll work with. I've worked with some hitters from the point that they were 12 to 22. That becomes very, that conversation is like, hey, do we sprinkle it in a little bit right around 13, 14? Do we get a lot? And then all of a sudden the conversation starts to get dominated by that by the time we're in high school and upper level travel ball. And I really do think there's probably some graph that exists where we can say, okay, here's a hitter. What are we working on? Mechanics or like really mechanical, like physical progressions or mental progressions? And what we need to look at is as the athlete gets older, we're probably going less and less on mechanics and more on mental. Like mental performance is really taking up so much of that. And when I say mental, that's like hey, what pitcher are you looking for? How do you evaluate a pitcher? How are you evaluating the strike zone? All those things that really give that hitter that extra 1 to 2% improvement.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned evaluating the strike zone, knowing the strike zone. I've talked about that on my other podcast, the Lap Epstein Hitting Podcast. So subscribe if you haven't done so already. But evaluating the strike zone, when does that come into play? Which lesson do you usually dive into? What lesson number to when you start talking about what the strike zone may be, depending on, of course, who the umpire is and depending on what the strike zone may be in different games on different days?
Sure. So if I have an athlete that's in season, they're in their high school season, middle school season, that usually comes up pretty soon. If I have a hitter who is in the off season, we're in October, November, December, they're not seeing live pitching for a while, we probably won't have that conversation until closer to season. So it's less of a lesson number and more of a timing of the year. But we do talk, I explain very distinctly there's a difference between the hit zone and the strike zone.
Mm-hmm.
Your hit zone is going to probably remain fairly consistent. Pitches that you like to hit when you're in a hitter's count. So I think that's another conversation that doesn't always get to have happen with an athlete. Like, what are your favorite pitches to hit? And who cares if the umpire is calling this strike really high? That's not your favorite pitch. We're not worried about that until we have 2 strikes on us. So we do have to delineate between what's in our control and what's out of our control. The strike zone is going to vary umpire to umpire, but in that same breath, we can learn to make adjustments off of, hey, I'm on defense. I'm noticing the umpire's calling a low strike. You have that in the back of your head for when you're, developing your 2-strike approach. And, it's hard because I don't get to be on a field with an athlete, but to be able to bring up those types of conversations, I think sometimes make a bigger impact on, teaching them, hey, you need to be palm up at contact, that sometimes that hit zone, strike zone distinction is huge for them.